Port of Dover, England, 1818. The Channel wind carried salt, cold, and things that never returned. At 19, Geneviève Rousseau held the French lawyer's letter as though protecting the last candle burning inside an empty cathedral. The thin paper trembled between her gloved fingers, while her brown eyes traced the lines for the 10th time since she had left the convent that morning. Urban property, Rue des Ormes, Abbeville. Registered in the name of Etienne Rousseau. Personal presence required for legal recognition. The words were painfully clear, and yet deeply unsettling. The docks of Dover were alive with noise and movement. Sailors shouted orders in rough English. Dockworkers dragged trunks scarred by years of crossings. Women in dark dresses guided children through the hurried crowd. Geneviève pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to look like what she was. A young woman alone, without family, without dowry, without visible protection. The nuns had been kind, but kindness was not belonging, and Geneviève had always known the difference. Someone brushed past her. The wind did the rest. The letter slipped from her hands. "Pardon," she said, bending quickly. Our gloved hand caught the paper before it could be taken by the gusts blowing in from the sea. Geneviève looked up and met the gaze of a tall man with a restrained posture, dark brown hair, and a grave expression. There was something about him that demanded silence. He held the letter with excessive care, and for a moment longer than necessary. As if, in that brief instant while the paper remained in his hands, something had been recognized before it was understood. As if it were not merely paper. His eyes were a deep blue, not cold but distant, like doors locked from within. "Mademoiselle," he said. His voice was low, controlled. "The wind here does not forgive distraction." He returned the letter without smiling, without asking anything, his expression unreadable. Geneviève murmured her thanks in hesitant English, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd like someone who had learned how to leave no trace. She looked down at the paper again. The words were unchanged. But something had shifted, an unfamiliar, unsettling sensation, as though fate had just brushed against her with invisible fingers. And she did not yet know whether it was mercy or condemnation. If you too cherish period stories, those that whisper like old letters and echo like longing hearts, leave your like and subscribe to the Countess's Tales. Your support allows these narratives to cross oceans and reach more souls around the world. And before you go, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Geneviève Rousseau had grown up in carefully cultivated silences, in the bright room above her father's small clinic in France. Silences of concentration, of respect, of a child who learned early to observe before asking questions. Only after her father's death, Etienne Rousseau, when she was 16, did silence change its nature. He had died in 1815, during the turbulent months following Napoleon's final fall. Officially, he was accused of involvement in activities deemed treasonous by the new authorities. Nothing was ever proven to Geneviève. Nothing was explained. She was simply told it was no longer safe to remain in France, and a few days later she was taken away, crossing the Channel to a country whose language she barely understood, carrying nothing but a surname and a quiet fear. She spent 3 years at the Convent of St. Cecilia in southern England, where she learned that questions no longer brought answers, only sympathetic glances, murmured prayers, and doors closed with gentle finality. The nuns never spoke of the war, and Geneviève accepted that. She had been taught that she must always accept. Now at 19, her brown hair pinned into a simple knot and wearing a brown wool dress that had seen better days, she stepped onto the plank of the merchant ship Cormorant, bound for Calais, summoned to claim an inheritance she had never imagined existed. The deck was crowded, merchants returning to the continent, retired officers leaving exile behind, entire families seeking new beginnings after years suspended by war. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. Everyone except Geneviève. She clutched her small worn leather case against her chest and searched for a discreet corner. Young women traveling alone invited questions, and questions she had learned were rarely harmless. That was when she saw him again. The man from the dock stood near the mast. his gaze fixed on the grey horizon as though facing something too old to be named. He did not observe the other passengers, nor did he seem eager for departure. There was a tense stillness about him, as if the ship were not carrying him anywhere, merely confirming a fate already decided. Geneviève looked away quickly, suddenly too aware of her own curiosity. And yet something in his silent profile, the rigid line of his shoulders, the way he held the railing as if he needed the support, stirred an unsettling certainty within her. He too carried unanswered questions. The cormorant began to pull away from the dock. England slowly dissolved into the cold morning mist. Geneviève closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of the waves beneath her feet. She did not know what awaited her in France. She did not know whether that forgotten house would be enough to rebuild a life. She did not know if she would ever understand why she had been sent away, while her father faced the end alone. But she knew, as with a quiet, unsettling clarity, that the man with the locked blue eyes was not there by chance, and that before the crossing was over, their paths would meet again. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The crossing began in murmurs. Geneviève found a place along the starboard rail, away from the press of passengers crowding near the inner cabins. The wind tugged at loose strands escaping her simple knot, but she did not mind. She preferred the sharp cold of the sea to the suffocation of curious eyes. Her small case rested on her lap like an improvised shield. Her fingers gripped its worn handles with more force than necessary. The lawyer's letter lay folded inside her dress pocket, pressing against her ribs like something alive, an unwelcome presence that refused to let her forget why she was there. "Regardez-la." The voice came from behind her, low, deliberate. A middle-aged Frenchwoman, wrapped in furs far too heavy for the crossing, leaned slightly toward her companion and indicated Geneviève with nothing more than her gaze. Alone. No maid. No escort. The other woman assessed Geneviève from head to toe, lingering a moment longer than politeness required. "Certain customs seem to have been abandoned," she murmured, "especially among young women who grow accustomed to living beyond their proper place." The words needed no clarification, disdain neatly wrapped in courtesy. Geneviève lowered her eyes. Heat rose to her cheeks, sharp and humiliating. She knew better than to respond. At the convent, she had learned that indifference could be a form of defense. "Ignore cruelty," the nuns had said. "It tires itself out." But here, silence carried weight. "To travel like this," the first woman added, raising her voice just enough to be heard, "it is hardly what one expects of someone respectable." Geneviève closed her eyes for a moment. She wished she had not come, wished she had never received that letter, wished the promise of belonging did not exact such a cost. "Mesdames, forgive me." The male voice cut through the air like a clean blade. Geneviève opened her eyes. The man from the quay stood there now, a few paces from the women. He did not raise his voice. He did not smile. His presence alone drew a line. "I believe your cabins are waiting," he continued, his French flawless, the faintest trace of an English accent beneath it. "The wind is shifting, and the deck is rarely kind to those who value comfort." It was not a request. It was a conclusion. The women exchanged offended glances, yet something in his posture, the way he occupied space without effort, as though the world naturally rearranged itself around him, made them gather their remarks and withdraw, muttering indignation as they went. Geneviève released her breath slowly. Only then did she realize she had been holding it. He turned to her. His blue eyes met her brown ones for a brief instant. And in that quiet second, Geneviève saw neither contempt nor curiosity. She saw fatigue. "Do not heed them," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "Cruelty is the only privilege some people still manage to exercise." She wanted to thank him, wanted to say anything at all, but her voice failed her. He inclined his head slightly, an automatic gesture, almost military, and stepped away before the silence could grow awkward. He vanished among the other passengers, but something remained. The air felt less hostile, as though an invisible barrier had been raised around her. Geneviève turned her gaze back to the horizon. England had already diminished to a distant grey line, Ahead, France remained hidden beyond the restless sea. She thought of her father, of the unknown house, of the man with locked eyes who had defended her without expecting recognition. And for the first time in 3 years, a daring thought took shape. Perhaps the world was not made only of those who abandoned. Perhaps there were also those who protected. Night fell over the channel. Geneviève did not seek a cabin. She had not enough coins for discreet arrangements, and her dignity, fragile as it was, would not endure another public refusal. She wrapped herself in her worn shawl and remained on deck, leaning against a coil of thick rope. Other passengers of similar means did the same. The cold bit. But it was bearable. She had known harsher cold. The steady roll of the ship held something hypnotic. Geneviève closed her eyes, letting the sound of the waves dull her thoughts. Sleep did not come. Memory did. Her father's face, now blurred at the edges. Only the lingering sense of gentleness remained, and of sadness, as though he had always known their time would be too short. "Mademoiselle." She opened her eyes, startled. The man stood there again. He carried a thick wool blanket folded in his arms. He did not step closer than necessary. Distance, respect. "At night the sea changes its temper," he said, extending the blanket. "Please take it. I have no use for it." Geneviève hesitated. To accept was to admit need. To refuse would be foolish. She took the blanket carefully, feeling the weight and warmth of the wool. "Merci, monsieur," she murmured. "May I ask why?" He did not answer at once. His gaze went to the dark water, as though facing something he preferred not to name. "Because I have already failed to protect those I should have," he said at last, "and because no one should cross the channel in the cold while carrying alone what you carry in your eyes." Before she could form a question, he stepped away, disappeared into the darkness of the deck. Geneviève pulled the blanket around her shoulders. Warmth spread slowly, not only from the wool, but from something harder to define. The strange sensation of having been seen. And at the same time the uneasy sense that such quiet protection might cost more than comfort, perhaps even more than safety. Chapter 2. Ghosts on the Deck. Robert Grafton had not slept properly in 3 years. He slept, yes, but never to the end. He always woke at the same point in the night, with the metallic taste of gunpowder on his tongue, and voices still demanding decisions that could no longer be undone. That dawn, on the deck of the Cormorant, was no different. Leaning against the port rail, far from the other passengers, he watched the stars fade behind the fog and pretended the cold of the channel might be enough to numb memory. It was not. The blanket he had given the French girl had not been a calculated gesture. It had come from his own trunk. An impulse, a mistake. Robert knew that. Gestures created bonds, and bonds demanded responsibility. Something he had learned in the harshest possible way, never to promise again. Yet when he had seen her curled beside the ropes, trembling beneath a shawl far too thin for the sea, something inside him had yielded. Something old, something he had believed buried since 1815. Protection. The word sounded almost offensive in his own mind. He had no right to it, not after failing when it mattered most. His fingers tightened against the damp wood of the railing. France lay there, invisible beyond the dark horizon. 3 years since he had left that soil wearing the uniform of a colonel in the British Army. 3 years since Abbeville. Abbeville. The name never came alone. It dragged fragments with it, exhausted soldiers, contradictory orders, civilians trapped between loyalties no one honored anymore. And at the center of it all, a French physician who naively believed that saving lives was still permitted in times of war. Dr. Etienne Rousseau. Robert closed his eyes for a moment. He had not given the direct order. He had never needed to. He had been in command, and that had been enough. He had signed reports, looked away, allowed subordinates to resolve the matter while he kept his hands clean only on the surface, because at night when the world fell silent, he saw the man's face with cruel clarity. Grey hair, tired eyes. They did not beg for mercy, they asked for time, just time to continue saving those who still breathed. Robert had denied him that. 6 months later, His elder brother Edmund died in a hunting accident as ordinary as it was final. The dukedom of Silverton fell upon Robert like an unrequested sentence. Title, lands, obligations, all inherited without merit. He tried to fulfill his duties, manage estates, sit in the House of Lords, behave as though the past were merely past. But guilt did not age, it grew. It was during the belated organization of documents confiscated during the occupation that he found Dr. Rousseau's journal. Yellowed pages, steady handwriting. A man who treated wounded soldiers on both sides because he believed humanity wore no uniform. In the final entry, written days before the execution, a sentence Robert had never been able to forget. If I die, let my daughter know that I tried to do what was right, even when the world insisted on doing wrong. Daughter. The word opened a new wound. Robert investigated in silence. Geneviève Rousseau, 16 at the time. Sent hurriedly to an English convent after her father's death. No known relatives, no true protection. When he learned that Geneviève would return to France to claim an inheritance in Abbeville, he did not hesitate. The city he had avoided for years was calling him back, not as divine punishment, but as consequence. The world had a cruel sense of symmetry. Nothing ever stayed truly buried. Without realizing it, Robert's gaze drifted back across the deck. Her silhouette was there, curled beneath the blanket he himself had given her. She slept poorly. Even at a distance, he recognized that kind of restlessness, the body that learns to take up less space, the mind that does not trust sleep. He did not know how much she knew. Probably little. His name did not appear in the records that circulated at the time, only ranks, regiments. Now he was a duke, too distant a figure from the machinery that had crushed her father. He should keep his distance. It was sensible, correct. But when those women attacked her, when he saw shame descend upon her like a cold public rain, Robert had been unable to remain still. Because she did not deserve it, because no one who had survived the war, even from its edges, deserved to be judged by those who had never been forced to choose between dignity and survival, and because, at its core, protecting her was the only way he knew to ask forgiveness from the dead. Anonymous penance. That had been the plan. To help her discreetly. To ensure she reached Abbeville safely, to smooth the inheritance process if necessary, and then to disappear. No explanations, no names, no contaminating what little hope still remained. But watching her there, sleeping beneath the blanket that had come from his own hands, Robert recognized the flaw. He already cared. And caring had always been the first step toward ruin. Dawn arrived slowly, washing the sea in pale gold. Robert had remained awake, not by choice, by habit. He stood near the mast when he saw her stir. She sat up carefully, disoriented, until memory returned. Her fingers touched the blanket. She looked around, searching. Robert retreated into the shadows before their eyes could meet. He could not allow this to become routine. Trust required truth, and the truth, when it came, would destroy any bridge before it was ever crossed. "Calais in sight," a sailor shouted. "1 hour to disembark." The deck came alive. Trunks, voices, anticipation. Geneviève folded the blanket with excessive care and looked around again. She wanted to return it, to thank him. Robert turned away and descended to the lower deck, where his trunk awaited. Coward, his conscience whispered. But sometimes cowardice was merely another name for mercy. Because if she discovered who he was, what he had done, that blanket would cease to be shelter. It would become a bitter memory, proof of a compassion already corrupted. Robert Grafton, Duke of Silverton, had destroyed enough. He would not destroy her as well, even if it meant disappearing, even if it meant never being forgiven. Chapter 3. A Land of Ghosts. Calais smelled of fish, rust, and old salt. Geneviève stepped onto the French quay and felt her legs weaken. It was not the motion of the ship, it was the weight of returning. 3 years had passed since she had left this country as a frightened girl, clinging to the hand of a strange nun who had promised that everything would be all right. Nothing had been all right. only different. Now she returned not as a daughter, but as an orphan, heir to something she had never been told about, to remnants left behind by a man she had barely been allowed to know. The blanket lay folded beneath her arm. Geneviève scanned the dock, searching for the man with the locked blue eyes. She did not see him. Passengers hurried past, reunited with relatives, bargained with porters, vanished toward places that were safely known. She remained there for a moment, alone, holding her worn case and the blanket she had been unable to return. Perhaps he did not want thanks. Perhaps for him, kindness was something offered, and then forgotten. Geneviève had not been raised to forget. She folded the blanket carefully and placed it inside her case, a simple act, almost ceremonial. One day, she thought, perhaps she could return it, or at least offer words that would not be lost in her throat. But first, she had to move on. The inn near the port charged half of what Geneviève possessed in exchange for a few hours' rest and a seat in the mail coach leaving at dawn. The room was too small, the mattress too thin, the air too heavy. 2 women shared the space with her. They snored loudly. They did not ask her name. Geneviève did not take offense. She was accustomed to being invisible. Lying there, staring at a ceiling stained with damp, she tried to imagine the inheritance awaiting her. A small property, the letter had said, but that could mean anything. A forgotten house, a worthless parcel of land, a place never intended for her at all. Why had her father never spoken of it? Perhaps he had not had time. Perhaps war granted no farewells. Or perhaps he had known that silence was the only way to protect her. Geneviève closed her eyes. Her father's face came to her only in fragments, steady hands, the scent of medicinal herbs, the tired smile that always appeared when she stepped into his improvised practice. He had been good. Of that she was certain. How good men became traitors, she still did not understand. The coach departed before sunrise. The journey to Abbeville took 2 full days. Muddy roads, long stops. The constant creak of wood. Geneviève shared the narrow bench with strangers who spoke little and observed too much. On the second afternoon, a young French soldier sat beside her. "Returning home, mademoiselle?" The voice was too casual. The smile lingered too long. "Yes," she replied without turning toward him. "Family in Abbeville?" "No." A pause followed. He leaned slightly closer. The scent of tobacco and sweat mixed with the stale air of the carriage. "Traveling alone is unwise," he said in a tone that pretended concern. "There are still Englishmen everywhere. Confusion. Dangerous people." Geneviève turned then, looked at him directly. "I know how to take care of myself, monsieur." Her reply was firm, practiced through years of necessity. The soldier drew back slightly. The smile did not vanish. It merely sharpened into caution. She turned her gaze back to the window and pressed her case closer. Inside it, along with her few belongings, lay the blanket and the letter bearing the address. Rue des Hommes, number 14, Elm Street. The name sounded far too gentle for a place marked by war. Abbeville appeared at dusk on the second day. The city was larger than Geneviève had expected, old, scarred, church towers cut into the golden sky, while many houses bore shattered windows and walls wounded by bullets. Fresh paint covered ancient stone, and beneath it all lay something harder to define. An old weight, a silence that came not from sound but from memory. A strange tightness seized her chest. She recognized no streets, no facades, no paths. And yet something there altered her breathing, as though her body knew where it stood before her mind could follow. This was where he had lived, and yet everything felt foreign. The coach stopped in the central square. A dry fountain occupied its heart, ringed by worn stone and hurried footsteps. Passengers disembarked quickly. Geneviève remained still for a moment, absorbing the place, not as one who arrives, but as one who returns without knowing exactly to what. She needed to find Monsieur Beaumont's office before nightfall. "Mademoiselle," the voice came from behind her. The soldier had stepped down as well. He stood too close. "I could help you find your way." Abbeville confuses those who do not know her streets. "That will not be necessary. "But I insist." He took a step forward. "The lady already has company." Geneviève turned. The man from the ship emerged from a side street, dark travel coat, boots worn by use, the same bearing that imposed silence without effort. He did not look at her. He looked at the soldier, and the soldier understood. "Pardon. I did not know," he muttered, and retreated quickly. Geneviève's heart beat far too fast. When the man finally turned his gaze to her, she saw something different in his eyes. Not only distance, there was fatigue there, and a restrained relief. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "Certain attentions are rarely harmless." Geneviève took a second longer than necessary to reply. She had not expected to see him there in Abbeville, so far from the ship, so far from coincidence. She began, finding her voice. "I wish to return your blanket." He blinked as though the matter were of no importance. "Keep it," he said, his voice firm, almost practical. "Winter here shows little mercy. I cannot simply—" "You can." He surveyed the square, the streets, the sky darkening too quickly. "Do you know the city?" "No," she said. "It has been many years, and I was a child then. I came only to settle an inheritance. I must find Monsieur Beaumont." He nodded, unsurprised. "I know the way. I can accompany you if you allow it, before night fully falls." Geneviève knew what she ought to do. Refuse, keep her distance, be prudent. But she also knew she was tired, that she was alone, and that this man had been the only constant presence of protection since she had left the convent. "Please," she said at last. He took her case carefully, as though asking permission even as he acted. They walked side by side through the narrow streets. Geneviève did not yet know who he was. She did not know that his name carried the weight of her father's death. She did not know that every gesture he made was an act of penance. But as they moved through Abbeville beneath the darkening sky, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. The simple, dangerous sensation of not being entirely alone. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 4. The Price of Proximity. Robert should not have stayed. He knew it from the moment he stopped on that dark corner of Rue Saint-Vulfranc. Knew it when he saw the light burning on the second floor, and recognized behind the thin curtain the outline of Geneviève's body moving back and forth. She gestured as she spoke, asked questions, tried to understand the inheritance that had fallen into her hands, like something too fragile to touch without fear. He knew that expression. Hope tangled with apprehension. The face of someone who sensed that every answer might be the last remaining thread connecting her to someone already gone. His fingers tightened inside his gloves. He should have left the moment he delivered her safely to the lawyer. That had been the plan. See her settled, make sure she was not alone, and disappear. But his feet did not obey. He remained there, standing in the shadows, like a man unwilling to admit he was keeping watch. "Coward," his conscience whispered. Once again. He drew a deep breath. The air of Abbeville carried a taste he knew well. Chimney smoke, horse dung, ancient damp clinging to stone. And something else. Something that came not from the city, but from him. Guilt. The entire city seemed built upon it. Every street, every corner. Robert did not know Abbeville as a visitor. He knew it as an invader. He had been there in 1815, wearing the red coat of the British Army, newly promoted to colonel. Too young for the rank, too proud to admit it. Abbeville was strategic. Supplies, control of the Somme, a population divided between silent submission and restrained resistance. And in the midst of that chaos, a French physician had tried to remain simply human. Robert closed his eyes. The past did not need to be summoned. It always returned on its own. Abbeville, March 1815. The improvised headquarters smelled of damp and old gunpowder. Maps covered the table, marked by hurried fingers and decisions no one wished to claim. Robert leaned over them when Lieutenant Harrow entered without knocking. "Colonel, we have a problem." Robert looked up. "Go on." "The French doctor, Rousseau." The name tightened something inside him. Immediate, physical. "What about him?" He's treating Napoleonic soldiers, wounded ones. Hiding them in a barn outside the city. Robert passed a hand over his face. Doctors have the right to treat the wounded. That's protected. Harrow dropped a paper onto the table. Not when they lie. He claimed to treat only civilians. We discovered he was helping soldiers escape. That's treason, sir. Robert read it, then read it again, each line heavier than the last. Treason. In occupied territory, the word required no proof, only blood. Does he have family? Robert asked, almost against his will. A daughter, adolescent, lives with him above the clinic. Robert closed his eyes for 1 second. Only one. Arrest the doctor, he said, his voice firmer than he felt. Hold him until further orders. And the execution? There was a brief silence, barely a second. Await superior authorization, Robert replied. I will review the case personally. Harrow hesitated, then nodded and left. Robert remained alone with the paper in his hands, knowing exactly what he was doing. Buying time, pretending time still existed. He promised himself he would return to the matter the following day, but the following day never came. Orders arrived from above, Wellington retreating, evacuation in 48 hours, chaos, documents burned, prisoners transferred like inconvenient cargo, and in the confusion, someone decided that Dr. Rousseau was too dangerous to release and too burdensome to transport. They executed him on the morning of the evacuation, a swift firing squad, no ceremony. By the time Robert learned of it, it was already too late. He signed papers, authorized confiscations, turned his back, and fled Abbeville. Robert opened his eyes. He was once again on the dark street, facing the illuminated window. Geneviève was still inside. He had not given the order, but he had not prevented it either. And in war, he had learned too late. Omission weighed as heavily as action. 6 months later, Edmund, his elder brother, died in a hunting accident as banal as it was final. Robert inherited the dukedom of Silverton, the title, the lands, the fortune, and the guilt. He tried to continue living, to fulfill obligations, to delegate responsibilities, but guilt did not diminish. It multiplied. Until, among forgotten military documents, he found Dr. Rousseau's journal. The final line never left him. If I die, let my daughter know that I tried to do what was right, even when the world insisted on doing wrong. Daughter, Geneviève Rousseau. The name surfaced months later, buried in rushed authorizations and cold records, a discreet transfer, a convent in the south of England. For the child's safety. He followed the trail in silence, not out of duty but out of guilt. When he learned years later that she would return to France to regularize a forgotten inheritance, he decided he would return as well. Help quietly. She did not need to know. He left the dukedom under temporary administration. Titles did not repair the past, but then she boarded the same ship. At first, it was only the name. The name he read by chance on the letter fallen to the ground at the quay, Geneviève Rousseau, engraving itself like an old wound that never quite healed. Only later came the face, the brown eyes, the contained solitude, the careful way of existing, as if she had learned early not to take up too much space in the world. And he knew. Now he was here, in the city where everything had begun, and the closer he drew, the greater the lie became, because Geneviève already trusted him. And that trust was a torment he deserved. The office light went out, the door opened. Geneviève stepped outside with the lawyer, who placed a ring of keys into her hand and disappeared up the stairs. She remained alone on the street, staring at the keys as one might hold something too precious to touch without fear. Robert stepped out of the shadows. "Mademoiselle," she turned, startled, then relaxed when she recognized him. That relief on her face struck him like a blow to the chest. "I thought you had already gone," she said. "I should have. I merely wished to be certain all was well." She lifted the keys. "The house is nearby, Rue des Ormes. It isn't large, it needs repairs, but it is mine." She said mine as though testing a new word. Robert felt the weight of it. "Would you like me to walk you there?" he asked before he could stop himself. Only to ensure your safety. She hesitated. The conflict was visible. I do not wish to abuse your kindness. It is not abuse, he replied. It is duty. Duty? She tilted her head. You do not even know my name. I know everything. I am Robert Grafton. He did not give the title. Geneviève Rousseau. She extended her hand. Robert took it. Glove against glove. Even so, he felt warmth. A pleasure, Mademoiselle Rousseau. His conscience screamed. But he did not release her hand at once, and neither did she. On that quiet street in Abbeville, beneath a sky darkening too quickly, Robert Grafton crossed the line he had sworn never to cross. He became involved, and he knew, with painful clarity, that it would come at a price. For him, and for her. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. The house on Rue des Ormes smelled of forgotten time. Geneviève turned the key in the rusted lock. The door resisted for a moment, then yielded with a long creak, almost a sigh, as though something inside had waited far too long to be awakened. The fading light of dusk spilled into the narrow corridor. It revealed peeling walls, worn floorboards, dust gathered like darkened snow. Geneviève stepped inside and felt the weight of absence, not only of furniture or life, but of something deeper. Belonging. Watch the step. Robert's voice came from behind her, low and steady. He entered just after, carrying her case in one hand and an oil lamp in the other, borrowed from the lawyer. The warm glow swept across the interior of the house, revealing empty frames, a broken chair propped against the wall, torn curtains hanging from the windows like weary ghosts. Geneviève swallowed. This had been her father's, this floor, these walls, this silence. It isn't much, she said, and her voice came out too fragile. But it is mine. She repeated the word because she needed to hear it. Mine. Robert set the case near the entrance and raised the lamp. There is furniture, he observed. It's intact, only forgotten. Geneviève followed him into the adjoining room. Small, a dark wooden table, 2 chairs, a low sideboard. At the back, near a fireplace long cold, stood a bookcase covered in dust. She ran her fingers along the back of one chair. The wood was cold, but solid. Someone lived here, she murmured. Do you think my father lived here? Robert did not answer at once. His gaze moved through the space like someone recognizing a place he would rather not remember. When he spoke, he chose his words with excessive care. Perhaps it was a family property, a place to keep things. Keep what? What we do not know how to carry. The words lingered in the narrow air of the house. A chill passed through Geneviève. He spoke like someone who knew too much. But the way he held the lamp, his fingers tight, tense, made her retreat. I'm going upstairs, she said, turning away before she asked what she was not ready to hear. The upper floor was low-ceilinged and smelled of old damp. 2 small rooms. The first was nearly empty, save for a mattress pushed into the corner. The second made her stop at the threshold. There was a trunk, large, dark wood, set beneath a window boarded shut, and atop it, folded with care, lay a white physician's apron. Geneviève entered slowly. The apron was stained, not with dirt, with use. Dark marks that had once been red, old blood, blood from lives her father had tried to save. She lifted the apron with both hands. The fabric was thick, well made. Along the sides, embroidered in faded blue thread, were the initials, E.R. Etienne Rousseau. The tears came without warning. Silent. She pressed the apron to her chest and felt something she had not felt in years. Presence. Not a distant memory, but something real, tangible. He had been here, touched this fabric, lived within these walls. Mademoiselle Rousseau? Robert's voice pulled her back. She turned quickly, wiping her face. He stood in the doorway, the lamp raised. Half his face remained in shadow. But his eyes reflected something that mirrored her pain. I found something of his, she said, holding up the apron. My father was a doctor. He helped people. Robert looked at the fabric. His jaw tightened. "I imagine he did," he replied almost in a whisper. She frowned. "Why?" For a moment, Geneviève sensed something about to break, something dangerous. But Robert withdrew, not just a step back, but inward. "Some things," he said quietly, "have a way of coming to the surface." It was not an answer, and she knew it at once. Still, Geneviève did not insist. She knelt before the trunk. The hinges resisted, then yielded with a metallic groan. Inside lay medical instruments wrapped in cloth, notebooks, letters bound with twine. And at the bottom, a small wooden box, locked. She lifted it. Something shifted inside. "May I?" Robert moved closer, kneeling beside her. "The lock is simple." Geneviève hesitated. This felt sacred. But he looked at her father's things with silent respect. "Please." Robert drew a small penknife from his pocket, worked with careful precision. The lock gave way with a soft click. He handed the box back without opening it. Geneviève lifted the lid. Letters, many of them, and on top, a folded page written in hurried script. She read it, once, twice, 3 times. The words, burned. "Dr. Rousseau, you will be arrested for treason. There is still time to flee. Take your daughter tonight. There will be no trial. The colonel of the regiment is under orders. He will not be able to save you." Geneviève read it again and again. Her hand began to shake. "He knew," she whispered. "My father knew he was going to die." Robert's voice faltered when he tried to speak. "Then, why didn't he flee?" Geneviève clutched the letter tightly. "He could have gone. He could have taken me with him." She read once more slowly. At the bottom of the page, almost as though reason had failed and something truer had slipped through, there was a note written in fainter ink, rushed and uneven. "If I flee, my daughter will carry the name of traitor. If I stay, they may let her leave. Perhaps they will let her live." The world rearranged itself. It had not been fear, not hesitation, not mistake. He had stayed because he chose to. He didn't flee because of me. Her voice broke. He stayed for me. The pain arrived whole, without warning, without defense. Geneviève folded into herself and finally allowed the sobs to break her. And then she felt the hand, steady, warm, on her shoulder. Robert said nothing. He did not explain. He did not ask forgiveness. He simply remained there, kneeling on the dusty floor, offering the only thing he still could: presence. When she could breathe again, she lifted her eyes. She saw guilt. She saw tenderness. She saw something she could not yet name. "He was good," she whispered. "My father was good." Robert tightened his grip on her shoulder. "He was," he replied, his voice broken. Geneviève did not perceive the weight of that word, did not realize he was not agreeing, he was confessing, and she did not see that the letter in her hands named the man responsible for her father's death, the colonel of the regiment, who knelt beside her at that very moment, and whose name she still did not know. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. Robert left the house before he did something irreversible. The night was cold, starless. The air tasted of burned coal and damp wood. He closed the door behind him with care, as though a rough movement might wake the dead. Geneviève had remained upstairs. He had heard her shifting papers, opening drawers, drawing deep breaths, trying to assemble, with letters and silence, the final days of a father who had chosen to die for her. Robert descended the front steps and stopped on the narrow pavement. He bent forward, bracing his hands on his knees, breathing like a man who had just broken the surface after being held under water. But he had not surfaced. He was sinking. "The colonel of the regiment is under orders. He will not be able to save you." The words hammered inside him. He had read them over her shoulder. Seen the hurried hand, the desperate warning, the kind of sentence only someone who knows war writes like that. Short, brutal, stripped of hope. Geneviève had read it too. Now she knew there had been a colonel, a man who had failed, And that man had been kneeling beside her on the dusty floor, offering comfort as though he had any right to it. Robert clenched his fists. He should have confessed. Right there. In the instant she looked at him with reddened eyes and said, "He was good." He should have answered yes, and I let him die. But he could not, because he saw the way she clung to his presence, as if it were the only steady thing in a house collapsing from the inside. Because he felt that if he spoke the truth in that moment, he would not merely be revealing a crime, he would be tearing away the last scrap of ground beneath her feet. And that terrified him. Coward. The word returned, as it always returned. Robert began to walk, with no direction. He only needed distance, from the house, from the letter, from the blood-stained apron, from the name that pursued him more faithfully than any enemy soldier ever had. Abbeville's streets at night were nearly empty. Here and there, a lit window. Otherwise silence, and as though the city had learned during the occupation never to draw attention. He passed Saint-Vulfranc. The Gothic tower cut into the black sky like a warning. Robert slowed. He knew that place. He had been there in 1815, during a mandatory mass imposed by Allied command to display peace and reconciliation. A performance. The French prayed with contained hatred. The British watched the exits. He had climbed those steps in a red coat, sword at his side, hat tucked beneath his arm, a colonel too young, too hard, too determined to admit any hesitation. Now he climbed the same steps, without a uniform, without announcement, without honor. The door was locked. Robert sat on the cold stone and stared at the empty square. The cold crept into his bones. But cold had never been his greatest punishment. The punishment was what came when he closed his eyes. 3 years since he had left this city, swearing never to return. A coward's promises were worth very little. He closed his eyes, and memory came. Not like a story, but like a precise blow. Abbeville, March 1815, the dawn of the evacuation. The improvised headquarters was pure chaos. Overlapping voices, rushed footsteps, iron striking iron, carts being loaded in frantic haste, papers thrown into barrels and devoured by flame before anyone could finish reading them. War, when it retreats, does not only take men, it destroys everything it cannot carry. Robert sat in a small, poorly lit office, signing transfers and dismissals without truly seeing the names. His hand ached. His eyes burned. He had not slept in far too long, and when exhaustion wins, the mind begins to accept anything, any order, simply to remain standing. The door opened without ceremony. Lieutenant Harrow. Robert did not look up at once. "Colonel?" He lifted his gaze slowly. "Speak." Harrow hesitated, and in that hesitation, something was wrong. Robert knew that silence. It was the silence of a man arriving too late. "The French doctor," the lieutenant began. "Dr. Rousseau." The name struck Robert like a dull blow. "What happened to him?" he asked, already feeling his stomach tighten. Harrow drew in a breath. "Captain Morrison signed the execution, sir." For a second, the world lost its sound. "What?" Robert rose abruptly. "That's not possible." "It was this morning." Harrow's voice remained low, controlled. He argued that treason in wartime permits no clemency. "And, as you were occupied with the evacuation, Morrison has no authority to do that," Robert snapped. "I said I would review the case." Harrow did not argue. He only delivered the final blow. "He had authorization from superior command, sir. Delegated power for swift decisions during withdrawal." The ground seemed to vanish beneath Robert's feet. "When?" "About an hour ago." A pause. "Firing squad in the West Yard." Silence. Not the silence of a church. The silence of something that cannot be undone. Robert dragged a hand over his face, trying to organize thoughts that no longer obeyed. "The body?" he asked, and his own voice sounded distant. "Mass burial, sir, with other prisoners. The carts have already been dispatched." Robert stared at the table. Stacked papers, stamped orders, rushed signatures, and somewhere among those sheets, the authorization that had allowed it all. That was when he understood. It had not been one shot. Not one soldier, not even Morrison. It was the system, the haste, the omission, his omission. "And the daughter?" he asked, almost a whisper. "The doctor's daughter?" Harrow looked away. "She vanished, sir." Robert did not press, not because he believed it, but because if she was gone, then at least one life had slipped free of the machinery that crushed the father. He closed his eyes and spoke like a machine, because that was what the world required of a colonel. "Record the death." His voice went neutral, professional. "Confiscate his belongings. We must follow protocol." Harrow nodded and left. The door shut. Robert remained alone. And there, in that suffocating office, surrounded by useless maps and burning papers, he finally gave way. He sat down slowly, covered his face with his hands, and he wept. Not only for the man who had died, but for the man he discovered he was. Obedient. And obedience, in that moment, did not feel like virtue. It felt like another name for cowardice. Robert opened his eyes. He was back on the cold church steps, the empty night, the silent square. Geneviève did not know he had been there that morning, years before. She did not know he had kept her father's journal as penance, and she certainly did not know he had returned to Abbeville because guilt has an address, and perhaps he would never be able to tell her. Not now. Because to tell her now, after comforting her, after touching her shoulder, after allowing her to trust him, would be to betray her twice. First, for failing to save her father, and then for offering himself as shelter. He rose slowly. His legs ached. The cold had settled deep. But something inside him decided. It was not courage. It was necessity. He could not bring Etienne Rousseau back. He could not undo the past. But he could keep the man's daughter from being swallowed by the same world that swallowed her father. He could restore that house, face the hostility of the city, use the title he hated, the one he never wanted, to protect someone who had no one left. Public penance. It would cost reputation, it would cost comfort, it would cost the mask of a respectable man. Perhaps it would cost enough that he should finally begin to pay. Robert returned to Rue des Ormes slowly. A faint lamplight still burned upstairs. Geneviève was likely reading, piecing it together, trying to understand why her father died and why she lived. He stopped before the door. He did not enter. He simply looked up at the lit window as though it were an altar, and in the silence he made a promise, not to himself, but to the ghost who lived in that house. "I will protect your daughter, even if she hates me when she learns the truth, even if it costs me everything. She will not be alone. I swear it." The wind rose. The light in the window trembled. Robert breathed in slowly. Then he turned and walked toward the inn where he had left his belongings. Tomorrow would begin. Tomorrow he would face the city. Tomorrow he would start paying the price he should have paid from the beginning. But tonight he would allow Geneviève a few more hours of peace, before the truth exploded, before everything collapsed, before she discovered that the man who had comforted her was the very one who once had let her father die. Chapter 7. Truth has a name. The first days in the house on Rue des Ormes passed like a slow awakening. On the first night, Geneviève barely slept. The house smelled of old damp and abandonment. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the wind found its way through poorly sealed windows. There was no prepared bed. Only a thin mattress leaned against the wall and dust everywhere. She spread the blanket Robert had given her on the ship over the makeshift mattress. It was rough, heavy, but warm. She wrapped herself in it, as one clings to something familiar in unfamiliar ground. For a moment she thought of the deck, the cold of the channel, the way he had placed it over her shoulders without a word. That memory was what finally allowed her to close her eyes. She slept little. But she slept. In the days that followed, she woke early before the sun fully reached the still dirty windows. She had decided she would raise that house and turn it into a home, her home. So she began to clean. She swept, washed the floors with cold water, scrubbed the walls until her fingers burned. The physical labor occupied her body, and for a few hours kept her mind away from the questions that still had no answers, away from the letter. Every night, before sleeping, she read it again. The colonel of the regiment is under orders. He will not be able to save you. But there was another reason she rose early. Robert Grafton came every day. He arrived in the morning, always at the same hour. He brought fresh bread, firewood for the hearth, sometimes simple flowers gathered along the way, offered without ceremony, as though such things were natural. She had never asked, never invited him. Still, he came. He repaired the door lock, replaced broken panes, covered the roof with temporary canvas. He worked in silence as though merely correcting something that deeply troubled him. She did not understand. Not fully. She asked once, carefully, whether he was not doing too much. He replied only that he did not mind, that he preferred to keep his hands occupied. He explained no further, and she did not insist. Shirt sleeves rolled up, dark hair falling onto his brow. Movements precise, economical, of someone accustomed to solving problems with his own hands, though he clearly did not need to. Geneviève watched. She pretended to arrange books, to prepare tea, to fold clothes. But she watched, the way he tested a board before stepping, how he measured distances with his eyes, how at times he would stop mid-task and remain still, staring at nothing, as though seeing something that was not there. And something dangerous began to form within her. By the fifth morning it could no longer be ignored. Robert was in the small backyard stacking firewood. The sun lit his back, outlining the shape of his body beneath the white shirt. Geneviève stood in the kitchen doorway, a cup of tea cooling between her fingers, and she simply looked. The way his muscles moved, his heavy breath after lifting the logs, the careless gesture of wiping sweat from his brow. Warmth rose in her chest. It had nothing to do with the sun. No, she told herself. She tightened her grip on the cup. It cannot be this, but it was. When he lifted his eyes and saw her there, when he smiled, brief and almost imperceptible, but real, her heart lost its rhythm. And Geneviève understood, with unsettling clarity, that she no longer saw him as merely a kind stranger. She saw him as possibility. He approached. "The tea has gone cold." She blinked. "Yes. I was distracted." "By what?" he asked, curious. "Not intrusive. Simply attentive." "By you," she thought. But she said, "By everything. By being here. By having a place." Robert held her gaze for too long. In his eyes there was something unstable, hope tangled with desperation, as though he wished to say something essential and could not find the courage. "Geneviève," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name without formality. The sound tightened something in her chest. "Yes?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. Nothing. "I'll fetch more wood." And he left before she could say anything. Geneviève remained there alone, holding cold tea and an unease she could not yet name. It was that afternoon, after rereading her father's letter once more, that she decided. She needed to know. She needed to know who the ghost in the letter was. Robert had gone to order new lumber. Geneviève watched him disappear down the street and felt something tighten in her chest, a formless unease, like when the body senses danger before the mind finds reason. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, locked the house, walked toward the central square. Abbeville was full, loud, too alive for a city still bleeding beneath the surface. Merchants shouted prices, children ran between carts, women argued over vegetables as if the war had never existed. Life insisted. Geneviève sought someone old enough to remember 1815, not out of curiosity, out of need. She found a man seated near the dry fountain, smoking a worn pipe, his face carved by time, eyes that had seen too much. "Pardon, monsieur, may I ask you something?" He studied her for a moment. "Depends on the question. Were you here during the Allied occupation?" He spat onto the ground. "I was. Unfortunately." Geneviève felt her stomach tighten. There was, at that time, a British colonel. Who commanded the troops here? Do you know anything about him? The man narrowed his eyes. Something shifted in his expression. Why do you ask, miss? Looking for someone lost to the war? She drew a breath. When she spoke, her voice was lower than she intended. My father was executed. They said it was treason, but he was a doctor. He only helped the wounded. Her throat closed. I need to know who the man was, who decided his death. Silence stretched. Too long. She thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, like someone unearthing something long buried. There was a colonel here. I believe his name was Grafton. Colonel Grafton. Too young for the rank. Had powerful relations in England. The world tilted. Did not fall. Tilted. Would his name be Robert Grafton? The question escaped her before she could stop it. The man shrugged. I don't know his full name, miss, but everyone knew him as Grafton. And he left many things unresolved when he departed. The air seemed thin, the name, the age, Abbeville, the constant presence, the quiet care, devotion, penance. Genevieve's legs weakened. She gripped the stone bench. Where might I find records? She asked mechanically. At the town hall, second floor. Whatever survived the war is kept there. She thanked him. She did not know how, or why. Her body knew before her mind accepted it. At the town hall, the clerk barely looked up as he let her pass. Genevieve searched boxes, papers, lists yellowed by time, and then she found it. A simple page. British Army officers. Abbeville, 1814 to 1815. Her eyes scanned the list until they stopped. Colonel Robert Leonard Grafton. Beside it, a handwritten note. Inherited the title of Duke of Silverton following the death of his brother. Duke. He had never told her, because he knew. Genevieve folded the paper with excessive care, as though the gesture might prevent it from being real. Then she walked back to the house. Robert was in the yard, working, stacking wood with his shirt sleeves rolled up, dust-streaked, fully absorbed in the simple task, as though repairing things were the only language he knew. When he saw her, he smiled. And that smile, the one she had begun to wait for, died when he saw her face. Genevieve? She held out the paper. Colonel Robert Leonard Grafton, Duke of Silverton. He did not move. You knew, she continued, her voice strangely calm. From the ship. You knew who I was. You knew what you had done. Genevieve, I did not give the order, he said too quickly. I did not command your father's execution. But you were in command, she replied, and you did not stop it. Silence. He did not deny it. He lowered his head. And that was worse than any justification. You let me trust you, she said, tears falling despite her efforts. You let me begin to... She stopped, because speaking the word would make everything irreversible. Leave. Genevieve. Leave my house. He obeyed. At the door, he turned once more. I would spend my life trying to repair this if... Please do not return, ever. The door closed. Genevieve slid down onto the kitchen floor. And she wept. She wept for her father. She wept for the man who had somehow become part of her life, and for the pain she had seen in his eyes when she sent him away. But above all, she wept because she understood, too late, that both of them had been crushed by the same force. War, which never truly ends. Not in times of peace, not inside silent houses, not inside hearts that try to begin again. Chapter 8. The Weight of Truth. Robert did not return to the inn that night. He walked, without direction, without destination. Only away, away from Rue des Ormes, away from Genevieve's face when she had sent him away, that mixture of pain and fury he had fully deserved. He walked to the edge of the town, where stone gave way to packed earth and fields stretched beneath a starless sky. He stopped beside a low ancient wall, leaned against it, and gave in. Not to tears, not to cries, but to that silent surrender that comes when there are no defenses left. When truth finally spoken, leaves no room for explanations, only acceptance. You let me trust you. Her words echoed inside him. Robert closed his eyes and saw, with cruel clarity, what she had not been able to say. He had seen it in her eyes, in the mornings when she watched him work, in the moments she lingered in the kitchen doorway, tea forgotten between her fingers, simply watching, in the way the silence between them had begun to stretch without discomfort. Something had been forming there, fragile, careful, nameless, and he had broken it before it could fully exist. He opened his eyes and stared at his hands, hands that had repaired her house, carried firewood, offered shelter, hands that had almost touched her face that afternoon, and withdrawn, because even before the truth he had already known, he had no right to touch what he could not sustain. A coward until then. But he did not need to remain one. When dawn began to pale the sky, Robert returned to the inn. The proprietor, half asleep, scarcely noticed him. He climbed to the small room, opened his travel trunk, and withdrew the object he had carried since leaving England. Etienne Rousseau's diary. Worn leather, yellowed pages, the precise handwriting of a methodical man. Robert had opened it only twice, when he found it among the confiscated belongings, and months later, when he decided to return to Abbeville. Now holding it in his hands, he felt its true weight, not of paper, of responsibility. That diary had never been his. It belonged to Geneviève. It was the voice of the father she had lost, and he had kept it in silence for 3 years. He sat at the narrow table, lit the candle, and began to write, and began. Geneviève, I do not write expecting you to read this, nor to forgive me. I write because the truth must exist outside of me. I was the colonel commanding the British regiment in Abbeville between November 1814 and March 1815. I was 26 years old. I was promoted too quickly, by name and connections, not by merit. When I was given command of exhausted men in a divided city, I was not prepared. Your father, Dr. Etienne Rousseau, treated the wounded on both sides. This was known. Some tolerated it, others did not. When they discovered he was hiding injured French soldiers, he was accused of treason. I did not believe it was treason. I believed it was humanity. Yes, I ordered his arrest, and I asked for time. I said I would personally review the case. I intended to find a way to release him without openly defying my superiors. Then came the evacuation. Chaos, urgency, burned papers, hasty decisions. Captain Morrison, acting under authorization from higher command, signed the execution order. Your father was shot on the morning of the withdrawal. By the time I learned of it, it was too late. I did not give the order, but I was in command, and I did not stop it. I signed the record of death, authorized the confiscation of his belongings, and I left Abbeville like a man fleeing. For many nights I wept alone, not from heroism, from delayed conscience. 6 months later I inherited the dukedom. I tried to continue living, but one day I found your father's diary among the confiscated effects. I read it. I understood, and I knew I did not deserve peace while his daughter faced the world alone. I returned to Abbeville for you, not by chance, not for business, because I knew you would return, and because I could not live knowing I had destroyed your family while you stood alone. I never expected to meet you on the same ship. I should have told you as soon as I saw you, or on the first night, or on any morning when you trusted me, but I did not. First because I was a coward, later because I began to care. You sent me away with reason. Before leaving, I return what was never mine. This diary belongs to you. It is your father's voice, his thoughts, and in the final entry he writes of you, of forgiveness, of hope. I do not ask for absolution. I ask only that you read, I will leave Abbeville tomorrow. I will not return, I will not seek you, but if one day you should need help, defense, a voice, I will be where I may be found, not from duty, not from penance, but because you deserve someone who comes when called, and because the man who failed your father will not fail you. Never again, Robert. Robert folded the letter, placed the diary carefully beside it. At dawn he would leave Abbeville, and for the first time since 1815 he would not be fleeing. He would accept the consequence, Because to care too deeply for someone, even in silence, means this: to speak the truth and bear its weight. Chapter 9. Rebuilding. Geneviève did not open the diary at once. She returned home holding it against her chest like a fragile relic, locked the door, sat on the floor of the sitting room. Late afternoon light streamed through the windows that now closed properly, casting golden squares across the clean floorboards. She looked at the worn leather cover, at the discreet initials stamped in the corner. E.R., her father's voice. At last. But there was fear, because reading would make everything real. Hearing the man she had lost, discovering things she might never have known. She drew a slow breath and opened the first page. January 15, 1815. Today I treated a French soldier who lost his leg. He said he would rather have died. I told him that life is always worth it, even when it no longer feels so. Geneviève asked why I help soldiers from the other side. How does one explain to a child that pain wears no uniform? I only said, because it is right. She understood. One day she will understand even more. Geneviève read page after page, notes about patients, reflections on war, small details about her, flowers she brought to the clinic, questions asked with solemn curiosity, memories her father had kept like quiet treasures. The tears came slowly, and then she reached the final entries. March 8th, 1815. I have been warned. They say I will be arrested. I could flee. I should. But if I flee, Geneviève will be marked, daughter of a traitor who ran. If I stay, there may be mercy for her. They say the colonel is not cruel, that there may be a fair hearing. I do not believe there will be one. War does not know justice, only convenience. Still, I will stay. For her. Geneviève closed her eyes. He had known, and he had stayed. Chosen death so she might have a chance, she continued. March 10th, 1815, before dawn. I hear boots outside. Geneviève is hidden. She is safe. That is enough. If these words ever reach her, I want her to know, do not carry hatred. The men who judge me are not monsters. They are tired, frightened men. Forgive when you can. Not for those who erred, but for yourself. Live, my daughter. Not merely survive, but live. Fully. Your father. Geneviève closed the diary carefully, pressed it to her chest, and wept. For her father. For the injustice. For the war that was still there, even years later. And she wept because she understood that forgiveness was not forgetting, but a door opened toward freedom. The weeks passed slowly. Little by little, Geneviève rebuilt the house with her own hands. She painted, sewed simple curtains, built shelves. Then neighbors began to appear, first curious, then kind. Abbeville was not only ruin, it was survival. In the fourth week, seated at the restored table, looking at her father's medical apron hanging on the wall, the decision came with clarity. The house could not belong to her alone. It had to serve. The next day, she began quietly. One room opened, one clean table, for anyone who needed it. She had no license, no title. But she had her father's notebooks. She had memory. She had care. The first patients came hesitantly. A feverish child. A man with an old wound. Geneviève treated them as she had learned by watching her father, and something inside her rearranged itself. She was not only honoring Etienne Rousseau, she was healing. The clinic was free. But Abbeville did not leave anyone alone. There was always bread on the table, firewood by the door, a neighbor willing to help. It was not payment, it was recognition. And because of it, she never lacked what she needed. It was on a rainy afternoon in May, 2 months later, that Geneviève sat at the table and wrote. She did not plan what to say. The words simply came. Robert, I read the diary. All of it. I understand things now that once only hurt. You failed, yes. My father also failed. The war failed us all. But he wrote about forgiveness, about not allowing war to win inside us. I have turned the house into a small place of help. It is free. This helps me understand why he stayed. I do not know if I can trust as I did before, but I know that your absence revealed something in me that did not exist before you. For that reason, I know the letter you wrote was an act of courage. If one day you wish to see what I have built, the door will be open. I promise no future, but I promise honesty. Genevieve. She sent it, and waited. May turned into June, June into July. Sometimes she believed no answer would ever come. Other times she was certain that one day he would appear. It was on a warm afternoon in August that she heard the knock at the clinic door. She looked up. Robert stood there, thinner, tired, hat in his hands. "Pardon, are you busy?" She finished dressing the boy's wound. The child ran out. Silence. "You came," she said. "You wrote," he replied. "And I could not stay away." He placed something wrapped on the table, new medical instruments. "For the clinic." Genevieve touched the cold metal. "You didn't have to." "I did." She drew a steady breath. "It will not be easy." "I know," he said, holding her gaze. "But I have time, and the will to try." Genevieve watched him. It was not complete forgiveness, not a sweeping love without scars, but it was true, and slowly she smiled. Beginnings, she had learned, did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be honest, and that was already enough. Epilogue. Abbeville, February 1819. Snow fell softly over Rue des Ormes as Genevieve closed the clinic door for the last time that day. It had been a long one. 8 patients, a child with a lingering cough, 2 elderly men whose joints stiffened with the cold, a young pregnant woman who needed listening more than medicine. Genevieve's hands smelled of herbs, alcohol, and harsh soap. Her shoulders ached, not from empty fatigue, but from the real weight of care. It was a good ache, the ache of purpose. When she turned, she found Robert near the hearth, feeding the fire with the wood he had cut that morning. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, dark hair falling over his brow. He looked ordinary, not a duke, not a man of war, just someone who had learned, late in life, how to stay. Genevieve watched him for a moment. A year earlier she had crossed the Channel alone, afraid of the future, a letter clenched in her hands. Now she stood there, in a house that had once been ruin and had become a home, beside a man who had once been absence and was now steady presence. "The fire is good," she said, stepping closer. Robert looked up and smiled, a brief, restrained smile, like nearly everything about him. "The wind is cruel tonight." She sat near the hearth, feeling the warmth reach her feet, her hands, her lower back, where in recent months her body had begun to ask for gentler care. Without thinking, she rested a hand over her still flat belly, the gesture almost unconscious. Robert noticed, he always did, but he said nothing. He took the folded blanket from the chair, the same one he had given her on the ship so long ago, and placed it over her shoulders with care. A simple gesture. Ordinary, filled with history. No one should cross the cold alone. He had said that once, without knowing how far those words would follow them. Robert sat beside her. The fire crackled softly. 1 year. 1 year since he had left Abbeville, swearing never to return. 1 year since he had learned that fleeing does not erase guilt, it only pushes it farther away. Now he lived there, not because the world had forgiven him, but because Genevieve had chosen to build something, despite everything. He divided his days between the clinic and the land. He used the dukedom's money to sustain what needed sustaining: medicines, instruments, the wages of 2 French physicians who came several times a week. The rest was done there, with familiar hands, trust patiently built, quiet recognition. The clinic remained free. It always would. And Abbeville was grateful. In England, people talked. A duke living in France, a foreign wife. A simple house, without luxury but warm, far from English salons. Robert went to London when necessary, handled what could not be avoided, signed papers, heard whispers. But he never stayed long. Here, in Abbeville, he was simply Robert. "I thought of something today," Genevieve said, breaking the silence. "The little girl with the cough, she reminded me of myself as a child." She drew a slow breath. "I think my father would be proud." Robert turned toward her. In her eyes there was light, not pain but something calm, steady. "He would," he said. "Very much." She took his hand, fingers intertwined, quiet certainty. "And you?" she asked. "Are you at peace?" He thought before answering. He always did. "Not completely. Perhaps I never will be. But I am where I should be." Geneviève nodded. "That is enough." Snow continued to fall outside, but inside the house on Rue des Ormes, the fire held steady warmth. The blanket covered 2 bodies instead of 1. And the silence no longer weighed. It was presence. Geneviève rested her head against Robert's shoulder. He kissed the crown of her hair, restrained, almost reverent. Then he placed his hand over hers, still resting on her belly. No words were spoken. None were needed. Because Etienne Rousseau had been right. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it allows the future to exist. And love, built with truth, choice and time, does not heal scars. It teaches us how to live with them, together.